All right, thank you very much for attending. My name is Winfield Myers, and we're going to discuss whether or not we can salvage our universities and what kind of tactics we might use to do so. So my guests today, I'll briefly introduce them since you have more extensive biographies in your programs. To my left is Victoria Coates. Victoria, and this is a point that we'll make for both of our guests today. Victoria is at the Heritage Foundation now, but she was trained as a Renaissance art historian. And that's an important point that we will come back to every now and then today as we move forward. She is a research fellow at Heritage, and more pertinent to our interest of what we're going to speak about, she was Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs during the Trump administration, during which she enjoyed, with her colleagues, great success, as you know, in certain endeavors they undertook. And so keeping in mind her background, to my right is Ken Marcus. Ken Marcus is well known to many of you, I'm sure. He's been an ally of the Middle East Forum for some time. And Ken is an attorney. He's founder and chairman of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. And he was Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education for Civil Rights during the Trump administration also. So they both have experience in the federal government. They were both successful in their careers in the executive branch. And both went to Williams College as well. And neither majored in Middle East studies or Islamic studies, and yet grew up to deal with the Middle East in Victoria's case and with Middle East studies in Ken's case. We're going to start with Victoria, and the topics we'll explore will be the one I've just outlined, the need for people who are outsiders to infiltrate, if you will, to come into both the federal government and to other areas in which the Middle East is treated, and what that tells us about the current state of Middle East studies, which is the pipeline to the State Department and to other federal agencies and to, of course, universities to shape our policies toward the Middle East. And we're also going to explore, especially a little bit later on, how we might be able to take advantage of the current national disgust with and anger at higher education, which has reached a boiling point in some ways, as evidenced by what you're seeing across the states. 34 states have introduced anti-DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion legislation. Many of them are simultaneously bringing out vocal opposition to critical race theory. And so we're going to see, how do we piggyback on that? How can we take advantage of that to reform Middle East studies while we reform other elements of the curricula? So Victoria, please, over to you.
Well, Win and Ken, it's a great pleasure to gather with you and be here under Daniel's aegis. Always an honor and to meet him or be with a fellow purple cow.
Yes.
So, all good. So this was a very interesting invitation for me because Win and I have known each other virtually for a little bit longer than we might want to admit. And so to be able to join him in person is a great pleasure after all those years. And the 2 points I really wanted to make regarding the art history thing, one funny story about it was another piece of my checkered past is I worked for Senator Cruz for a number of years. And in those early days, a enterprising reporter would discover my dirty little secret of having a PhD in art history about every 6 weeks and then breathlessly report this on Twitter. And Ted, who is a Twitter hound, if you know anything about him, would always catch these things and then send them to me in great mock outrage of how had I done this and tricked him so badly. And I knew I had actually arrived toward the end of the Trump administration. What turned out to be a cub Washington Post reporter did this. And I sent it to a bunch of more senior Post reporters that I happened to know saying, look, you guys, at some point you got to knock this off. And they all disavowed it. Like, we don't know this person. And we think it's great you have a PhD in art history. You're the most cultured person in the Trump administration. So that sort of came full circle, but I was reflecting on that when we were discussing this topic, and I think the problem we've run into, and art history in particular has become a punching bag as a kind of useless liberal arts topic that churns out a bunch of effete people who might be fit to work in a museum but don't have any other practical purpose to them. And, it's been alarming to have everyone from Marco Rubio to Barack Obama take shots specifically at art history as a discipline. But participating in this panel got me to thinking about why. And I think we've gotten into something of a vicious cycle, and again, this does apply more broadly to the humanities, that we've gotten away from the rigorous teaching of the discipline. That the way art history is being taught now is so devoid from the understanding of the vast majority of Americans, regardless of your degree of education, and has veered wildly into gender studies and ethnic studies, and a kind of a inclusiveness that denies the existence of excellence. That if you say Michelangelo's David is the greatest work of art that's ever been produced, and we can debate that, I would probably come down in the affirmative, and there are various reasons. There are other obvious contenders, but if you say that, that means something is not as excellent. And that got some people into trouble in Florida recently. But this notion of excellence is somehow discriminatory against other traditions. And that means that we can't grade things anymore. And you can't say that, every undergraduate should be able to speak intelligently about the Mona Lisa or anything like that. And so we are teaching the discipline poorly, which means the people who come out of the discipline don't have many fungible skills. And back in the reign of the first Queen Elizabeth, when I was in graduate school, this is something else that that came to my mind thinking about this topic. The notion of how you were prepared was not so much about the topic of your dissertation, but the way you were taught to think. And the nastiest thing they did to us at the University of Pennsylvania at the conclusion of our oral exams is they gave us 72 hours to write a seminar paper. And the topic, again, was immaterial. What they wanted you to demonstrate is that you could control the bibliography, you had the language skills to read what you needed to read, and you could form a coherent argument that was persuasive to your professors. That's been done away with. And so, when I came out of that program, I had, the thinking skills, the analytical skills, the writing skills that at a random date in 2007 had Don Rumsfeld look at me and say, I want you to come on board and help me with my memoirs, which is how actually I made the jump from being an art historian into national security policy. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is the problem with Middle East studies, which is obviously our core topic here today. And what I encountered in the Trump administration were a lot of people who were just utterly convinced of things that were not true. They might have been true some number of years ago, but they certainly weren't true in 2017 on. And the key example of that is the approach to Israel's role in the Middle East and getting to additional peace deals between Arab countries and the Jewish state. And we had all been told for these many years that a Palestinian deal had to come before any additional peace deals. And this had simply been repeated so many times that it became an article of faith. And we bought into that. I spent a year working with Jason Greenblatt and Jared Kushner on the so-called deal of the century, a year I'll never get back. And we were in good faith, laboring to try to get to that happy state of affairs in order to pursue the deals we knew were possible, because we had been talking to our friends particularly in the Gulf, but more broadly Arab friends, and we knew everybody was ready to get to what eventually became the Abraham Accords. And what's interesting is it was the just utter, trying to think of a nice word for the Palestinians, refusal on the part of the Palestinians to engage in any way on what was, as I said, a good faith effort to get to a good deal for them. Because that's one thing Donald Trump understands, is the nature of a good deal. It has to be enduring, it has to be acceptable to both parties. He was willing to engage on that, and the Palestinians weren't. And at some point, late in 2019, our partners, particularly in UAE and Bahrain, said, you know what, they don't have a veto anymore. And so this article of faith that the Palestinian deal had to come first was no longer true. And what's extraordinary to me is the degree of resistance that got after we announced the Abraham Accords. That it was as if people's, sort of, again, core beliefs had been threatened or undermined because that turned out not to be true. And so, you know, as we go forward with Middle East studies, as we go forward with hopefully the humanities survive in some form, you know, addressing these two issues, addressing how we're teaching a discipline and how relatable it is to most people's experiences, and then re-examining core assumptions in Middle East studies that may need to be reevaluated would be the two topics I'd really like to pursue. So, thank you.
All right, outstanding. Thank you. Thank you. Switch to Ken for a moment, and then we'll switch back and forth as we go along. Ken, we discussed, Ken and I have discussed the various legal and legislative remedies that you have pursued, that the Brandeis Center has pursued, legal in particular, combating BDS, other things in higher education. Could you just tell us in your remarks that, among other things, how are you addressing these issues now at the Brandeis Center and in your work?
Well, I would love to talk about that. I was getting worried that I was going to have to talk about Italian Renaissance art, or maybe expand it to the Rococo, or Bernini's Saint Teresa. I think I might slide with over, but I don't want to debate with Victoria on that.
I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Bernini, so I'm not going to fight you.
Oh, okay. So I think I would go with maybe the whole Santa Teresa.
It's not bad. It's not bad.
Okay. But the question is about the legal aspect. So it was really an honor a few years ago to work with Win, with Daniel, with the Middle East Forum on the misuse of federal funds by Middle East studies programs that were supposed to be using federal taxpayer money in order to help build a pipeline of American workers who would be trained and motivated to support U.S. defense and national security apparatus. And instead, the universities were taking this money and using it for political indoctrination that was monolithically anti-Israel and often anti-American as well.
Let me just interject. This is Title VI of the Higher Education Act of 1965, not to be confused with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Same number, Title VI, but very different pieces of legislation.
Nothing confusing about that at all.
Nothing in the world.
And part of the concern at that time was it's bad enough that this was creating something of an academic sewer in Middle East studies programs and miseducating students. It was also being used to indoctrinate high school teachers through additional programs so that they would reach down deeper into the American educational system. But beyond that, it was having an extraordinary negative influence on the culture of the university, where taxpayer funds were supporting anti-Zionist extremism, which was creating a toxic environment on campuses. And we were able, I think, to some extent in the Obama administration and more in the Trump administration, to get some reform, a little bit more consideration of the statutory requirement that these universities, when they take federal funds, have a balance of perspectives and a diversity of views. But now it seems with this administration, there's really little or no a monitoring of this continuing federal requirement. But what's worse is that while we still have now some of those same problems we talked about, these Middle East studies programs are still monolithically anti-Israel. They're still funded by the taxpayer. They are still contributing to a toxic environment on campus. But the toxic environment on campus is actually different than it had been just a few years ago when we last worked on this. At that time, it was possible to ask questions like, what are the hotspot campuses where some of the worst of this is happening? And I could talk about the campuses, the 6 or 8 or 10 campuses where we'd had problems last year and therefore could anticipate having problems next year. Well, those same campuses are still problematic, but it's no longer plausible to say that there are any campuses that aren't hotspots. There's really no campus that we can look at and say that is not likely to be a trouble spot in the future. And moreover, the problems we're seeing are not just toxic influences on the general atmosphere on campus, bad as that is, but much more targeted in-your-face attacks on individual Jewish students. Certainly those for whom Zionism is in any respect a significant part of their identity. So it's not just that BDS will come to campus and there will be anti-Semitic language and tropes and speakers and all the rest of it, then oftentimes leading to altercations. But what we're seeing is more systematic efforts to exclude Jewish students in a variety of ways. So certainly some high-profile incidents like University of California at Berkeley Law School, where 9 law student groups said, if you support the state of Israel, you cannot speak to us on any topic whatsoever. If you're a feminist legal scholar and want to speak to us about some feminist issue, but it turns out you're pro-Israel in any respect, you can't come. If you're a rapist, but you're anti-Israel, there's no rule that prevents you from coming. If you are anti-Asian, there's no rule that says you can't speak to the Asian law group, unless you're also pro-Israel, in which case there is a rule that you cannot. But we're seeing it all over the country. Oftentimes organized efforts to exclude Jewish students from positions in student government, especially officer positions, sometimes from student judicial boards, very explicitly because of their Jewish background, sometimes related to Israel and sometimes more tenuously related to Israel, and in some cases because individuals who are not themselves Jewish but are perceived as being connected to Jewish people. So what we're seeing, unfortunately, is the worst of what we were predicting, and we are seeing it both spreading, getting more saturated. It is broader on the calendar sense because students are no longer putting things aside during breaks. During breaks, they're still online. During the summer, they're still online. So if they're not in person to organize mischief, they're nevertheless. So it's 12 months. It's 24/7. It's the entire country, and it's much more targeted, specific to Jewish students, and in your face. Fortunately, the pushback is also stronger than it had been before. The Brandeis Center is stronger. Other organizations have entered the fray, so there's more of a battle. But I will say that we have our hands full right now, coast to coast.
Absolutely. Thank you, Victoria. In the State Department, you mentioned the pushback that you got for the sin of having novel ideas and approaching things in a way that the establishment, I would call it the funnel of Middle East Studies graduates into government, which of course is what Title VI was founded in part to accomplish. But if 30, 40, 50 years ago that was a good idea, it's now a baleful influence. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of people who were most vociferously opposed to you within that establishment? Were they Middle East Studies scholars? I'm sure some of them were trained there with undergraduate degrees. And talk about the kind of opposition you received and what it took to overcome that as an outsider, both to the Middle East Studies establishment and to the State Department.
Well, now I'll add a third thing that I was an outsider to, and that was the Department of Energy, because I technically have never been an employee of the Department of State. I was a political appointee to the National Security.
Mistake.
Oh, that's okay. Well, there's a slight caveat to that. I was a political appointee to the National Security Council staff, and then I was a political appointee to the Department of Energy. Under that guise, I did 2 extended tours in 2020 in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. And so when I went abroad, I technically became a State Department employee, although I was the Secretary's Special Representative for the Middle East. So, but within that, I think where we really saw it most clearly was in the original decision to move the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And we then, as the Trump administration folks who were pursuing this through the White House, got into this morass of Middle East scholars, most of whom had come through these very specific vaunted programs that feed into the Foreign Service primarily, although also to some extent into the intelligence community, who gave us the very terrifying briefing on how if you move the embassy, the sky will fall, the Arabs will attack, the streets will run with blood, and you will countermine Israel's security if you do this. And I mean, literally with tears in their eyes, they would tell us this, because they were legitimately concerned that we were going to cause a cataclysm through our ill-advised sort of adventure in Israel. And it really was a credit to somebody else who came to this from the outside, David Friedman. Does not have a degree in Middle East studies, but David was convinced that the circumstances that had shaped that thinking were no longer the case, and but the people doing the thinking couldn't see the changed circumstances, and that we were going to have to really break some china to and then actually get this done to demonstrate to them how wrong they were. And so, you know, that is a reality that permeates the Foreign Service. And the one quick thing I'd add to that is this focus on, you know, and I'm sorry if I'm calling out anybody's alma mater, but Hopkins and Georgetown, these feeder schools, means we don't get people from what I would refer to as America. You know, we don't have folks from, you know, the University of Oklahoma or whatever you want to say, coming into that line of work because they don't feel they have an opportunity. So, you know, what outreach we can do to other types of academic institutions who are perhaps less toxic in this department, it could wind up being quite helpful.
And when they opposed you, so they came to you with tears in their eyes, did they make every effort to block you administratively, bureaucratically?
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
what did you have to overcome?
No, this is a special genius at the Department of State. And what they hit on was the absolute impossibility of, in any kind of short time frame, establishing physically an embassy in Jerusalem. That this was going to be a 10-year process. We had to shop for real estate. We were going to have to build it into very specific security codes. I mean, despite the fact that the formal congen in Jerusalem, which if you know Jerusalem is nowhere near East Jerusalem, it's in West Jerusalem, close to the King David, was a 19th century building which is literally crumbling and has very questionable security. Happy to operate out of that. But no, there's no way we can possibly do the embassy process in anything less than a decade. So sure, maybe we'll look at doing this in 2028. And again, this is where Ambassador Friedman was invaluable. He said, absolutely not. We have that consulate over there. Why don't you just, you know, take a cocktail napkin, write embassy on it, and tack it to the door? And if, you know, Mike Pompeo says it's okay, then that's the embassy. So we had to battle them on that. But that was going to be their chosen method to thwart us.
So by hook or crook, they were determined, but you overcame them. So yeah. Well, Ken, didn't Brandeis Center recently file a lawsuit against BDS? Am I right about that? You've litigated BDS in places, have you not? Or
all the time.
Yeah, that's right.
So last year, the Ben & Jerry's case was probably one of the.
Okay. Can you tell us about the effectiveness of that as a tool? And I don't know how often this is related to Middle East studies, but I do know that Middle East studies is the heart of the BDS movement on many campuses. The professors themselves are. And after all, it was founded by Hatem Bazian, who is a lecturer in Middle East studies at Berkeley. Not BDS, I'm sorry, SJP, my mistake. The BDS receives massive support from these scholars. They don't critique it, they don't stand against it. How effective a tool is that in going after BDS on campuses.
Sure. Maybe I'll say a word on Ben & Jerry's since you invited me
Sure,
to
absolutely.
go to campus. So
Yeah, of course.
Ben & Jerry's, I think, was an example of showing that sometimes law is necessary to hold institutions accountable. There are lots of different tools that different groups use, but it was really suing Ben & Jerry's over their decision not to sell their ice cream. They said it was just within the disputed areas, but under Israeli law, they wouldn't be able to sell it anywhere. So it was suing them on behalf of their Israeli, not just distributor, but licensee. That was what forced them to the table and what forced Ben & Jerry's to agree to allow American quality products, the Israeli licensee, to sell Ben & Jerry's in perpetuity, and the only difference is that they no longer have to pay any money to the folks in Vermont. So I don't think that there was, yeah, right. I don't think that there was any other way of breaking that boycott other than by suing them. That was unfortunately the only language that they understood. So on campuses, oftentimes it's administrative complaints that we file. We're always looking at potential federal district court actions as well, but it's holding institutions accountable by filing complaints with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which has the agency I formerly headed, which has the capacity to turn off all federal funds whatsoever. And that is what gets universities' attention, the possibility of turning off all federal monies to them.
How real a threat is that, do you think? What are the chances that could really happen to a university, do you think?
So last year, there were 17,000 cases filed with OCR, not anti-Semitism per se, but just in general, different cases alleging discrimination based on race, color, national origin, age, sex, et cetera, et cetera. 17,000 cases. Of those, 0 will likely result in a cessation of federal funds, because anytime you get close, the institution typically folds, whether it's a university or a school district. But what happens is once the agency finds even a serious civil rights concern, it creates a very substantial motivation for the institution to start making changes. Sure. So that's what we're going for. So for instance, at University of Vermont last month, even the Biden administration, for the first time, forced a university to enter into a resolution agreement, and it was based on anti-Zionism. It was based on allegations of a whole range of activities excluding Jewish women from, sexual assault survivor a group if they were Zionists. And that was just one of many of the incidents. But this is what I'm talking about targeted harassment and exclusion of Jewish students. And on that one, the Biden administration, to their credit, required the University of Vermont to come to the table and to agree to processes and procedures. But we often do get pushback from faculty, from Middle East studies as much as any. And what that does is it makes it harder for administrations in those cases where they would be willing to come to the table. Administrations are less likely to, and that's why you really have to hold their feet to the fire then with the federal government.
The faculty opposition strengthens their hand in resisting your litigation, I assume, right? I mean, that is to say, if the faculty, if by some miracle the faculty were to be horrified at such things, then the administration would be, if not undermined, certainly weakened. But with they're an added force, it sounds like, to the administrative resistance.
You never really see a case where there's a complaint involving anti-Black discrimination and the faculty is divided, and you find professors saying, no, it was free speech, or no, it was something else. If it's anti-Hispanic, if it's anti-disabled, it's only when it is anti-Semitism that you get the faculty divided and oftentimes up in arms against.
Yeah, no shot. Well, let me switch a little bit to looking ahead to, we've heard now the problems that Middle East studies cause in the State Department that Victoria had to combat. I'm sure that are still there, that are systemic to bureaucracies like that, which aren't going to be reformed within our lifetimes, short of collapse probably. And we've heard a little bit about what the Brandeis Center is doing on various fronts too. Looking ahead to the current national anger at higher education and the legislative actions against DEI and CRT. Victoria, I'll turn to you first. Do you think there's a way of piggybacking Middle East studies reform into this national movement? Not to replace it, of course, but to take advantage of this rare opportunity. I've certainly never seen universities this much under assault in my lifetime by the popular public. They've gone so far around the bend, they've finally gotten everyone's attention. Do you see any possibility of reforming, getting down into the more micro level of that through these movements?
I do, and I guess I take one tiny issue with what Ken said originally, that all of these campuses are toxic. I would make the case for Hillsdale.
Okay.
And I will repeat this to my daughter, who is concluding her sophomore year there. So she is a proud card-carrying member of the Hillsdale campus, and actually my introduction to Hillsdale was in the Rumsfeld office. One of our interns was just a recent Hillsdale graduate, Aliyah Kietek, who comes from a great Zionist Ohio family. And she said, I asked her why she went to Hillsdale, and she said, when I took my campus tour, I saw Israeli flags in people's rooms. And I would ask them, are you Jewish? And they would say, no, we just love Israel. And she said, I knew I was home. And she said, there were maybe 6 Jews on campus, but we were included, celebrated, and encouraged, not punished or excluded. And so what was amazing to me, getting Gardner into Hillsdale, which is another long story about the failure of higher education, because she was so miserable at Occidental, she had to move the middle of her freshman year. The school has become technically elite. They are dropping below the 20% acceptance rate, which puts you in a different category as an academic institution. And I think that points to the fact that there is such a hunger for this product amongst people who would like their children to learn something of value and not be indoctrinated in ideologies that most Americans, and I think this is the other piece of good news, find repulsive. Regardless if they have traditionally voted Democrat or Republican. So I think tapping into that, looking for other institutions that could potentially fill that void, and then you're going to literally see a reduction in applications to what we might consider our more woke traditional universities, even the Ivies, and an increase in applications to these schools. They're going to notice, because ultimately what's going to move the traditional schools is not an ideology, it will be their bottom line. And if they see that being threatened, if they see donations from alumni going down significantly, are we going to put a dent in Harvard's endowment? Probably not, but there are a whole lot of other schools that don't have, basically the income of a small nation in their endowment, that are going to start to have to be very, very concerned about this. So I think for Middle East studies, again, doing our best to encourage students coming out of less extreme institutions to get into these professions, demonstrate that there is another way to approach these problems, it certainly is possible.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, I'm not usually a sunny optimist. I deal with Middle East.
Ken, how about you? What are your thoughts on this?
Right now, there's tremendous energy in the States. So right now, I would say this is a good time to take some of the reformist energy and clean up all the problems that have to be cleaned up. I'll give you an example of something I worked on, but I'm embarrassed to say it starts with a story of significant failure. So a few years ago, a delegate, not a Jewish guy, but delegate in Virginia came to me. He wanted to try to close down a BDS event at one of the public universities in Virginia. And I was a little embarrassed to say, I'm afraid I can't just support you with that, because based on the facts that you just described, I think that the no-goodniks have a First Amendment right to what they're doing. And if you convince the president of the university to close down the event, he would get sued successfully under the First Amendment. So I said, your heart's in the right place. I love what you're doing. I can't support that because as much as I hate BDS, I think that would backfire. So he said, what should, and so I said, how about this? One of the strongest tools that we have to fight anti-Semitism right now is the so-called IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. You're familiar? I'm seeing a lot of yeses. So the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, among other things, demonstrates how certain forms of anti-Israel animus should be understood to be what it is, which is anti-Semitism. And that's at the root of BDS and lots of other things. I said, let's create a bill here in Virginia that would say that anytime there's an incident on any campus or any other public space, and the question is whether it's anti-Semitic, use the IRA working definition. And he wrote a bill. And it was a spectacular failure. Just couldn't get it out of committee. But people heard about it, got people's attention. And legislators in Tennessee introduced a bill. We had a big battle there. Everybody was against it. Free speech, everything else. Another big failure. South Carolina folks called me, said, here you're, that was a two-time loser. Here you've got this bill, should we bring it here? Well, in South Carolina, it was a success. It was a partial success, but it was a success big enough that it then went from other states. Last week I was in Richmond, where it started. Governor Glenn Youngkin signed a new version of exactly the same bill that had failed 5 years ago, and was something like the 27th state to adopt it. More than half of the states have now, in some form or other, either by gubernatorial executive order or by state legislation, have adopted the IRA working definition, and it's and going. So we've got more than half the country, but we're moving. So I think that maybe in a couple of years we can renew in a more serious way at the federal level. But right now I think that there are huge opportunities for reform with some of these outstanding legislation.
The 10th Amendment is not dead, after all.
There you
we're
go.
Here. Good. We'll take some questions here from you guys. If you have any more, please pass them around, and one of my colleagues will pick them up. Interesting question. Can you talk about the negative influence of French intellectuals on U.S. education, anti-Semitism, postmodern theory? The French never accepted the fact that their revolution did not work, but the Americans did, as did the Zionist revolution. So any thoughts on that?
I would just say I noticed a tweet. Apparently I'm spending all my time on Twitter over the last 24 hours, in which the sort of question was generally posed, what is one of the worst events of human history? And a French person responded, the French Revolution. And there's a reason, and this shameless book plug, I wrote a book about the history of democracy, which goes through 10 works of art. And the French had to get 2 chapters because their first effort was such a spectacular failure. And I think the really sort of untold story of the underbelly of what we think of as the Enlightenment. And it's hard to criticize the Enlightenment because, of course, everybody wants to be enlightened, and that's what they call it. But the anti-religion, the anti-Semitic undertones of that, I think, really were a besetting sin of many of those individuals, and it's people as beloved as Voltaire. You're supposed to run around saying you don't like Voltaire. Well, if people call you a barbarian, but there's a real problem there. And if we don't examine that, and we don't, it doesn't mean you can't appreciate some achievements, but at the same time, you've got to recognize who these people were. And that this is perhaps not the golden age of intellectual freedom that we have been led to believe.
I would add to that one heir to that, much of that school, at least, of course, in Middle East Studies, and his baleful influence was, of course, Edward Said, who deconstructed Middle East Studies and had a stunning effect, given this is one man, one bad book, came out in the late 70s, 78, I think, and just absolutely eviscerated the field or added to. It's one of those questions we'll never know. What would have happened without Said? But I can't imagine it would have been. It might have not happened as quickly, but it would have certainly gone down with the rest of the humanities.
May I add?
Yeah, please do.
So, I think back in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, we saw tremendous influence of French and to some extent German thought on the postmodern trends in the university that came together with what became anti-colonization, post-colonial thought, together with anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And of course, Michel Foucault's thought is very prominent in Said's and in and that whole school of thought within Middle East studies. But in the 2020s, I think that we've unfortunately sunk below the French to the extent that there are reactions within France to efforts to bring American wokeism to Paris. So it might be that that there were negative influences from European theory into the United States a generation ago, but right now, unfortunately, I think we've descended a bit lower than some of the European intellectual movements.
Yeah. We can no longer reach if nothing else, the intellectual complexity of some of the baleful influencers from France, you're saying, in a sense, which goes back to what you mentioned earlier, Victoria, in your first remarks, that we're now producing students, undergrads, scholars, who are so ill-trained in what they do that they are worse than useless. They're coming into the state and going out and teaching in public schools and teaching in universities who really don't have an understanding of the topic at all.
No, I agree. And I mean, I think, when you say that you've sunk below the French, you're plumbing the depths, as it were. But I do think that's, the core issue here in the humanities world is we have let that rot, sort of metastasize to the point where the disciplines themselves are unrecognizable and are being eaten from within. So I think that, when you have a school, and not to just harp on Hillsdale constantly, but this wonderful daughter of mine elected to stay in Hillsdale, Michigan for an extra 3 weeks so she could do her C.S. Lewis intensive with her favorite professor. So she will be spending 3 weeks immersed in C.S. Lewis, which almost sounds old-fashioned or archaic in a way, but I think is going to be one of her great educational experiences. That can still happen, but you got to make an effort.
Yeah, and of course there are other areas than Hillsdale, but what we're lacking is a large research university that's capable of doing that. Speaking of outsiders, a Byzantine historian named Warren Treadgold, a friend of Daniel's, wrote a book a few years ago calling for the establishment of a new research university along the lines of the University of Chicago and Stanford in the last century, headquartered here, preferably, and made up, initially at least, of faculty, disgruntled faculty from universities around the country, not necessarily conservatives, but people who know, as Victoria's pointed out, who know their topics, who know what they're talking about, and are sick and tired of the oppressive orthodoxies under which they have labored for these many years. Anything else to add on the French before we move on? I don't want to miss an opportunity to. Okay.
Oh, I guess one quick thing there, is I know there is an effort afoot for this Austin University, which folks may have heard of, to make Austin kind of the Stanford to University of Texas is Berkeley.
Please do expand on that.
I don't know a great deal about it. I know some of the folks who are involved. They're good people. I know some of their funders, also good people. But I think that there at least is an effort underway, and I think that is in and of itself encouraging.
So I would say that there are efforts that are underway that are encouraging in the sense that it's good that there are efforts underway, but nothing that I've seen is at a level where I can think, oh, this is going to be a real change. So Some are in the private side, some are in the public side. So there are efforts within state legislatures to create centers within public universities that will be sympathetic to American values, as in Texas.
Outposts.
There are efforts in places like Florida to take colleges that have gone astray and to try to fix them up. But so far as I can tell, it's been tinkering largely at the margin. There has been no effort that really has done something. I mean, when you think about the vastness of our public university system, we're sort of tinkering at the margins of reducing payments to diversity, equity, and inclusion faculty, which is good, but it's not transformative. Or putting relatively small amounts of money into academic centers, but without any significant control over the faculty who go there. So I think what we're seeing is the beginning germination of ideas without any real execution. But it is a first sign that there are people, including elected officials, who realize that public higher education is a problem that can be fixed and should be fixed. To do it right requires a far greater scale than what's been thought of now.
Let me ask you, how do we move, to use a term I learned in grad school, liminal cases, from the margins to the center to do precisely that? What again, piggybacking on the current national mood of the malaise that we've experienced.
I mean, right now we've got symbolic efforts, putting in, a new president at this institution or creating a center for that. But and symbolism matters. Symbolism is good. But what you really need is significant dollars. Mm-hmm. You need to have a mechanism under which there is control over faculty selection. Trustees need to take seriously a fiduciary duty and not just rubber stamp what's happening within the institutions. And there needs to be really a creation of new systems and new centers rather than just marginal changes to existing structures.
Yeah. Victoria.
I think, unfortunately, to borrow Ken's phrase earlier, it's going to take a spectacular failure to galvanize scaled change. And so whether it be a lawsuit that bankrupts a significant university that we would have thought was untouchable, but they can be bankrupted that way. Whether it's a major university that does something so incredibly foolhardy in terms of its faculty retention or how it's allocating its resources, again, that there's a financial meltdown and they're not bailed out by the federal government. And I think that would really send a shock through the system that would enable some reforms. So sort of borrowing Rahm Emanuel's phrase that we shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. And I'm afraid we're going to need some event like that to get us beyond what our sort of green shoots phase that we're in now to actual implementation.
How about coalition building, working with others? Important, no doubt. And we'll switch from my question to one from the audience again. Can you describe the components of anti-Semitic, anti-Israel groups, background of those who oppose it? And we're running out of time, so either one of you take that. It'll probably be the end of the.
I'm sorry, the components of the groups?
Yes, who is responsible for the massive increase in anti-Semitic acts that we have seen on campus?
I mean, we all are, those of us who aren't making a difference and taking action. I would say that we do see on many campuses particular student groups that are taking the lead in making things worse. Oftentimes they go under a name like Students for Justice in Palestine, sometimes with support from groups with Jewish names, like Jewish Voices for Peace. Over the years, the names of the groups will change, and some of these groups are more decentralized than others. But the problem isn't just the small number of overly influential and vocal students who are members of particular groups. It's the fact that the rest of the campus sort of folds. Mm-hmm. It's not the one student group at Berkeley Law called Law Students for Justice in Palestine. It's the 8 others that just capitulated to them. And some of them said, well, we didn't really think about it too much. They seemed like a good group. They asked us to do something. We thought it was the right thing. That was 9. It was after the national brouhaha over it that another reportedly 13 groups with full knowledge of what then joined them as well. So it's not just the one group of campus radicals with a mission that is antithetical to the Jewish people. It's all of the others who will simply abdicate responsibility and just jump on board.
I can't improve on that.
Okay, okay. Well, yeah, well, okay, we did start, okay, thank you. Another audience question, good, good, good. In a generation, won't the vast immigration backfire on the black and white, not meaning race, I think, the good and bad, oppressor meme when millions of the first generation of the new arrivals feel no compulsion to identify with it? Let me change that slightly and note that something that scholars have noted, for Martin Kramer, Daniel, and others have noted for years, is that Middle East studies has become largely an ethnic studies enterprise and takes full advantage of the victimology, heroism that goes along with that. Would a national change against this victimhood cult have any effect in Middle East studies, do you think, given that?
Well, I'm not sure I'm answering the question correctly, but where my mind goes on that is having worked for a number of Texans and watching Texas and the sort of annual refrain of, oh, we're going to turn Texas blue, which time and time again has proven to be inaccurate, largely because the migrant population in Texas has not turned out to be as liberal as everybody thought they were going to be. And, knowing folks like Cassie Garcia and Maya Flores, both of whom were, candidates in this last cycle, and others like them, and being from Pennsylvania, where we have a very large population, the folks who came here legally, and established citizenship and established lives, tend to actually trend conservative and not want to be victims. And so I think, working on immigration as an issue to get it right so that we can accept the folks that, that we need here in the United States, to strengthen our country. We're all children of immigrants in one way or another. That could potentially be a good thing, but it's not just going to happen on its own.
Thank you.
Yeah, I generally agree with Victoria. I think it could go either way, and it has been surprising to see with the Hispanic populations how within a few generations people will be voting like non-Hispanic Americans. It could go either way. It is disconcerting to see in California with ethnic studies, immigrant population joining with other groups in a progressive coalition, which gives you a curriculum which is anti-Zionist, which is anti-Semitic, and which is anti-American. It's also disconcerting to see that we've often lost the moral confidence in order to inculcate our values to new Americans, which I think creates a risk both for immigrants and also for new generations.
And with that, we will end. Thank you very much. Thank you, Victoria, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you.